The vibrant hues of a Florida morning, usually a source of cheerful warmth, felt almost mocking as the Andersons, David, Sarah, and their vivacious 6-year-old Lily stepped into the sprawling, fantastical domain of Enchanted Kingdom in 1992. For Lily, it was a pilgrimage to a world made real from her wildest dreams. Her eyes, wide with wonder, darted from the towering spires of Cinderella's castle to the bustling parade of beloved characters. Every corner shimmered with the promise of magic. Every melody from the hidden speakers filled the air with unbridled joy. Lily, with her bright yellow sundress and a mischievous glint in her eyes, had a special affection for Lucky the Fox, a cheerful, oversized character known for his playful antics and booming laugh. She had clutched a worn, dog-eared picture of Lucky, torn from a park brochure, for weeks leading up to this day. Now, standing in the serpentine line, her small hand firmly clasped in Sarah's, she bounced with impatience, her gaze fixed on the plush orange figure in the distance. The sun beat down, a benevolent golden blanket over the bustling crowds, the air thick with the scent of popcorn and sweet dreams. As they neared the front of the line, the joyous chaos of the park swirled around them. David, ever the photographer, fumbled with his new camcorder, eager to capture Lily's beaming smile with her hero. Sarah, momentarily distracted by a persistent fly buzzing near her ear, shifted her weight, glancing away for a split second, a fleeting instant. The line moved forward, a continuous, eager stream of families. When her gaze snapped back to the spot where Lily had been, the space was empty. The bright yellow sundress, the tangle of sandy blonde hair, the shining eyes, all were gone. The laughter of the surrounding crowd suddenly sounded hollow, distant. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized Sarah, tightening its icy grip around her chest. David, sensing the shift, looked up from his camera, his smile dissolving as he took in Sarah's ashen face and the terrifying emptiness beside her. Their frantic whispers quickly escalated into desperate cries, their voices thin and reedy against the cheerful din. They pushed through the bewildered throng, a desperate, swirling vortex of panic in a sea of manufactured happiness, their pleas for Lily swallowed by the relentless symphony of the park. The magic had vanished, replaced by an unbearable, echoing silence. The 15 years that followed Lily's disappearance were a desolate, silent expanse for Sarah Anderson. The vibrant colors of Enchanted Kingdom had faded into a monochrome blur of grief, each passing year etching deeper lines of sorrow onto her face. Their small coastal home, once filled with the effervescent laughter of a child, had become a mausoleum of untouched memories. Lily's bedroom remained exactly as it had been on that fateful morning. A yellow sundress draped over a chair, a half-finished drawing of Lucky the Fox taped to her bedside table, a worn picture book lying open on her pillow. Sarah would often sit there for hours, tracing the patterns on the wallpaper, trying to conjure Lily's presence, to remember the exact sound of her footsteps, the precise inflection of her voice when she called for Mommy. The silence in the house was a constant, aching presence, far more deafening than any noise. David, unable to bear the oppressive weight of the past, had moved out years ago, their shared grief having splintered their once unbreakable bond. He found solace in work, in distance, in anything that wasn't the echoing emptiness of their home. Sarah, however, remained rooted, tethered to the belief that if she stayed put, if she kept the space ready, Lily might somehow find her way back. She saw a therapist weekly, a kind woman with gentle eyes who listened patiently as Sarah recounted the same story, the same agonizing details, week after week. The therapist spoke of acceptance, of moving forward, but those words felt alien, a betrayal of the hope she clung to. The disappearance had garnered national attention for a time, a small face plastered on milk cartons and news segments. But eventually the clamor subsided, replaced by the relentless churn of new tragedies, new mysteries. The leads had long since gone cold, every tip investigated, every flicker of promise extinguished. The local police, though sympathetic, had closed the active investigation years ago, the case relegated to the ever-growing stack of unsolved cold cases. Periodically, a call would come from a private detective, a volunteer from a missing persons organization, offering renewed hope, but these invariably led to dead ends, leaving Sarah even more hollowed out than before. Each false dawn chipped away at her resilience, leaving behind a brittle shell. Then came the storm. Hurricane Elena, a monstrous swirl of wind and water, ripped through the Florida coast with a primal fury. Days of torrential rain had transformed the familiar landscape into a watery wasteland. Homes were ripped from their foundations, ancient trees toppled, and the very earth seemed to have liquefied under the assault. Roads became rivers, and entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath a churning brown tide. The storm's fury was a fitting external mirror to the tempest that raged within Sarah. She had watched the news reports from her living room, numb to the scale of the destruction, feeling only a weary recognition of the chaos. She had already lost everything. What more could a storm take? Yet, even in the depths of her despair, a primal human instinct for survival pushed her to secure her own small, waterlogged haven. Little did she know, this cataclysmic event, this act of nature's indiscriminate violence, was about to unearth a truth long buried, a sliver of hope she had long given up on. The storm, in its indiscriminate wrath, was about to deliver a brutal, yet potentially miraculous revelation. The call came as a jarring intrusion into Sarah's quiet, mournful existence. The old rotary phone, a relic of a bygone era, rang with an insistent shrillness that echoed in the silent house. It was Sheriff Brody, his voice gravelly and serious, cutting through the weary haze that perpetually clouded Sarah's mind. He spoke of the hurricane, of the unprecedented flooding that had scoured the landscape, revealing secrets long buried beneath the mud and debris. Then came the words that sent a jolt of ice and fire simultaneously through her veins. "We found something, Mrs. Anderson, something unusual, at an old, abandoned warehouse near the coastline, completely submerged until a few days ago. It's a costume, a character costume. Looks like Lucky the Fox." Sarah's breath hitched, caught somewhere between her throat and her pounding heart. Lucky the Fox, the very character Lily had been so captivated by, the last figure she had been seen with. It was an impossible, grotesque coincidence. Sheriff Brody continued, his tone cautious, "And there was something inside it, Mrs. Anderson. A video cassette. Pretty badly damaged by the water, melted in parts, but it was definitely a VHS. The drive to the sheriff's office was a blur of scarred landscapes and displaced memories. The familiar highway, once lined with vibrant green foliage, was now a desolate ribbon of cracked asphalt flanked by skeletal trees and overturned vehicles. Every mile was a testament to the storm's raw power, a stark reminder of how quickly the world could be reshaped. Sarah's own grief, a constant companion, was suddenly joined by a potent, terrifying surge of anticipation. For 15 years she had lived in a limbo of not knowing, a purgatory of stagnant hope. Now, a grotesque piece of cloth and a ruined tape threatened to shatter that stasis, to pull her back into the agonizing uncertainty. When she finally arrived at the sheriff's humble, storm-battered office, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and stale coffee. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face carried the weathered lines of years spent witnessing human sorrow, stood by a table. On it, laid out on a plastic tarp, was the object of his call. It was a grotesque parody of joy. The Lucky the Fox costume, once bright and welcoming, was now a waterlogged, mildewed husk. Its once fluffy orange fur was matted and dark with grime, the large, friendly eyes now vacant and staring, their plastic surfaces scratched and dull. The wide, painted smile seemed less cheerful and more like a macabre grimace. It was smaller than Sarah remembered, shrunken by the water, and distorted in a way that made it seem almost menacing. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, a phantom touch of cold fur. It was unequivocally lucky, yet horribly wrong. She reached out a trembling hand, hesitating, before finally touching the damp, coarse fabric. The feeling was sickeningly real, a visceral connection to the last moments of her daughter's documented presence. Sheriff Brody then pointed to a small sealed evidence bag beside the costume. Inside lay the cassette. It was a dark, amorphous blob of melted plastic and magnetic tape, seemingly beyond repair. The hope that had flared so intensely moments before began to flicker, threatening to die out under the harsh glare of reality. How could anything emerge from such a ruin? Yet, as Sarah looked at the deformed costume and the ruined tape, a desperate whisper of intuition told her that this was no random coincidence. This was a piece of Lily's story, finally surfacing from the depths. The aftermath of Hurricane Elena left the landscape a skeletal parody of its former self. Trees lay uprooted like discarded toys, houses were mere husks, and the very air hung heavy with the damp, metallic scent of standing water and decay. Amidst this scene of desolation, the local authorities worked tirelessly, sifting through the wreckage, cataloging losses, and searching for any glimmer of what once was. It was during one such grim sweep, in a remote, waterlogged section of the county, that Sheriff Miller's phone buzzed with an urgent call. On the other end was Deputy Jenkins, his voice tinged with a mixture of disbelief and unease. "Sheriff, you're not going to believe what we found out here. Down by the old abandoned Costume Corner warehouse, just off County Road 17. The storm surge really tore through it." The Costume Corner was a relic, a forgotten business that had once supplied the theme parks with their whimsical outfits before shutting down decades ago. It had been left to rot, a crumbling monument to forgotten joy. "What is it, Jenkins?" Sheriff Miller asked, his tone weary. He'd seen enough despair and destruction in the last few days to last a lifetime. "It's a mascot costume, Sheriff, a big one, looks like some kind of fox. And it's badly damaged, waterlogged, and caked in mud, but the weirdest part is what we found inside it. A melted, almost unrecognizable VHS tape." A cold tendril of intuition, sharp and unsettling, snaked its way around Sheriff Miller's gut. A mascot costume. A fox. It was a long shot, a desperate, irrational leap, but the details nagged at him. He remembered the old news reports, the haunting image of a missing child from Enchanted Kingdom, a case that had never truly left the collective consciousness of the state. He remembered the specific details. A little girl, 6 years old, who had vanished while waiting to greet a character. Lucky the fox. He directed Jenkins to secure the scene and carefully extract the items. He knew who he had to call. He had met Sarah Anderson once, years ago, at a community event commemorating missing children. Her quiet strength, overlaid with an almost palpable grief, had left a lasting impression. He remembered the desperate pleas she'd made on local television, the faded photo of her little girl clutched in her hand. The phone call to Sarah was made with a heavy heart, the words chosen carefully. He started with the discovery of the warehouse, the storm's role in unearthing long-buried secrets. Then, gently, he described the damaged costume, emphasizing its resemblance to a character from Enchanted Kingdom. Finally, he mentioned the VHS tape, fragile and likely corrupted, but still a potential clue. He downplayed the certainty, spoke of long odds, of mere possibilities, trying to cushion the inevitable surge of hope and subsequent crash of disappointment. For Sarah, the sheriff's voice was a distant hum, a low thrum against the sudden, deafening beat of her own heart. A mascot costume, a fox. The words sliced through the thick fog of her grief, igniting a raw, almost unbearable flicker of hope. It was a terrifying sensation, this sudden emergence of possibility after so many barren years. Her body trembled, not from cold, but from the electric shock of a dormant emotion awakening. She gripped the phone, knuckles white, her breath catching in her throat. She found herself agreeing to come down to the station immediately. the drive suddenly feeling like a race against time, against the insidious doubt that had been her constant companion for 15 years. As she hung up, a solitary tear, hot and stinging, traced a path down her cheek, the first tear not of sorrow, but of an agonizing, fragile hope. The air in the police station was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken anxieties. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the somber faces of the officers and the scattered debris of the recent storm reports. Sarah sat across from Sheriff Miller's desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, a silent plea in her eyes. On the desk, between them, lay the two objects that had disrupted the 15-year stillness of her grief. The water-damaged, grotesque remnants of the Lucky the Fox mascot costume, and a small distorted VHS tape, its plastic casing warped and melted in places. The costume was a horror, a mockery of the joyful image etched in her memory. Its once vibrant orange fur was matted and stained with mud, its once cheerful face now a lopsided, vacant grin. One eye was missing, a dark, hollow socket staring blankly. Sarah felt a visceral jolt, a physical revulsion, yet an undeniable pull. She reached out a trembling finger, tracing the coarse, damp fabric near where the head would have been. Sheriff Miller, observing her carefully, spoke in a low, measured tone. "We've had our forensics team take a preliminary look. It's definitely the Lucky the Fox design from Enchanted Kingdom in the early 90s. But there are anomalies." He pointed to a seam near the shoulder. "See this stitching here? It's not factory standard. It's a much coarser thread, and the stitching pattern is irregular. Almost like it was taken apart and reassembled or perhaps repaired by someone without professional equipment." He moved his finger to another area near the wrist. "And inside, where the wearer's hand would go, we found these odd metal loops. They don't belong there. They look like some kind of makeshift anchors, perhaps for something heavy, or to restrict movement." Sarah's blood ran cold. The implications of what he was saying were terrifying. The costume wasn't just found, it had been altered. Not for performance, but for some darker, unknown purpose. The makeshift anchors sent a chill down her spine. The joyous symbol of Lily's last happy moment had been twisted into something sinister. She wanted to scream, to tear at the dilapidated fabric to demand answers from its silent, grotesque form. But she held it in, a desperate need for answers overriding the burgeoning terror. "And the tape?" Sarah's voice was a whisper, barely audible above the hum of the lights. Sheriff Miller picked up the small, mangled cassette. "This is where it gets tricky, Mrs. Anderson. It's been submerged in salt water for who knows how long, and exposed to extreme heat and pressure from the debris. It looks almost fused. Our standard equipment can't even get it to load. The chances of recovering anything from it are slim to none. We can send it to a specialized lab, but that takes time, and honestly, the success rate for something this damaged is incredibly low." He softened his gaze, seeing the flicker of hope in her eyes dimming to a desperate plea. "I understand this is incredibly difficult, Mrs. Anderson. We need to manage expectations." But Sarah didn't hear the caution. She saw only the tape, this small, insignificant rectangle of plastic and magnetic film, as the last remaining thread connecting her to her daughter. It was fragile, perhaps broken beyond repair, but it was something. It was more than she had had in 15 years. A wave of fierce, protective determination washed over her. She would not let this last chance slip away. The costume, with its silent, altered details, spoke of a hidden truth, and the tape, no matter how damaged, held the potential to scream it. She knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that this, finally, was where the real story began. Sarah left the police station with the weight of the world pressing down on her, yet a fragile, almost unbearable sliver of purpose had ignited within her. The sheriff's words about specialized labs and low success rates echoed in her mind, but she dismissed them. She couldn't afford to be pragmatic. Not now, not when Lily's life, or at least the truth of it, hung in the balance. Her motherly instinct, dulled by years of hopelessness, was now a sharp, insistent demand for action. She began her search in the most analog way possible, flipping through the yellow pages, a relic in itself for any mention of video restoration or data recovery. The first few calls were disheartening. Most places dealt with modern digital formats or simply scoffed at the idea of salvaging anything from a VHS tape described as melted and waterlogged. Each rejection was a small, sharp stab, threatening to deflate the fragile hope that had begun to inflate within her. Then, buried deep in a faded advertisement section, she found it. Retro Tech Solutions, specializing in vintage media recovery. The address led her to a cluttered, unassuming storefront nestled between a laundromat and a dusty antique shop in a less traveled part of town. The scent of ozone and old electronics hung heavy in the air, a peculiar comfort. Inside, the shop was a chaotic symphony of obsolete technology. Reel-to-reel players sat beside ancient record players, mountains of tangled cables snaked across the floor, and shelves groaned under the weight of countless dusty VCRs. Behind a counter piled high with circuit boards and tools, a young man with a wild mop of dark hair and intense, focused eyes looked up from a dismantled projector. This was Will, the gifted student engineer Sarah had heard about, a local legend in the niche world of vintage tech repair. He was still in his early 20s, but his face held the concentrated intensity of someone far older, absorbed in his own complex world. Sarah hesitantly explained her predicament, holding out the mangled VHS tape like a fragile sacred artifact. Will listened, his expression unreadable, his gaze occasionally darting from her face to the damaged cassette. He took the tape, turning it over in his hands, his fingers delicately tracing the warped plastic. He hummed thoughtfully, a low, contemplative sound. "This is a challenge," he finally stated, his voice quiet but firm. "Severe water damage, signs of extreme heat exposure. The magnetic tape inside is likely fused, perhaps even dissolved in places. We're talking about molecular-level degradation." He looked up, meeting her desperate gaze. "Most people would say it's impossible, a fool's errand." Sarah's heart sank, but she refused to let the disappointment show. "But is it impossible for you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She saw the glint in his eyes, a spark of intellectual curiosity overriding the initial skepticism. He was an engineer, a problem solver. The word impossible was a challenge, not a barrier. Will tilted his head, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "Nothing is truly impossible, Mrs. Anderson, when you understand the underlying principles. It will take time, and it will be painstakingly slow. I'll need specialized equipment, some of which I'll have to improvise. I can't promise anything. The data might be too far gone, or it might be fragmented, unreadable." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the tape, lost in the complex dance of science and hope. "But I will try." His words, cautious as they were a lifeline. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline, a profound sense of relief. She had found a kindred spirit in this quiet, brilliant young man, someone who saw not just the damage, but the potential for recovery. She left the shop with a renewed sense of purpose, leaving the fragile piece of her past in Will's capable, almost magical hands. The clock was ticking, but for the first time in a very long time, Sarah felt a faint, tremulous pulse of hope. While Will meticulously worked on the delicate task of resuscitating the drowned VHS tape, Sarah found herself unable to sit idle. The image of the mangled Lucky the Fox costume, with its suspiciously altered seams and strange internal anchors, gnawed at her. It was a tangible link, a silent witness, and she felt an overwhelming urge to understand its secrets. The sheriff had mentioned non-factory standard stitching, a detail that had resonated with Sarah. Her own grandmother had been a seamstress, and Sarah had spent countless hours watching her skilled fingers manipulate fabric and thread. She remembered the precise, almost artistic way her grandmother had approached every stitch, every seam. Her thoughts turned to Mrs. Dorothy, a woman from her old neighborhood, a true artisan of textiles. Mrs. Dorothy had been a local legend, a retired theatrical costumer known for her uncanny ability to discern the origin and quality of any piece of fabric or stitching. Sarah vaguely recalled her grandmother mentioning that Mrs. Dorothy had even done work for some of the smaller local theme park performers, making custom outfits and repairs. It was a faint memory, a whisper from the past, but it felt like a thread she had to pull. Sarah drove across town to Mrs. Dorothy's modest bungalow, nestled behind a riot of bougainvillea. The scent of lavender and old paper permeated the air as Mrs. Dorothy, frail but with eyes that still held a sharp, intelligent glint, greeted her. Sarah carefully explained the situation, her voice hushed as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile spell of hope. She then presented the matted, mud-caked section of the fox costume the sheriff had allowed her to bring, focusing on the anomalous stitching. Mrs. Dorothy, donning a pair of worn spectacles that sat perched on her nose, took the fabric in her gnarled hands. Her fingers, though age-spotted and slightly trembling, still possessed a remarkable sensitivity. She ran them over the coarse, uneven stitches, her brow furrowing in concentration. She picked at a loose thread, then held the fabric up to the light, scrutinizing it. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, Mrs. Dorothy nodded slowly, a knowing look in her eyes. "Yes," she murmured, her voice thin but clear. "This is not factory work, too uneven, too deliberate in its imperfection. This isn't just sloppy. It's a specific technique, almost like a signature, if you know what you're looking for." She paused, her gaze distant, lost in the labyrinth of memory. "I remember this handiwork. There was a young man, a long time ago, a few years before I retired. He was one of my apprentices for a short while. Obsessed with character costumes almost to a fault. He had a peculiar way with a needle. Self-taught, but with a strange intensity." Sarah's breath hitched. "Do you remember his name?" she pressed, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Dorothy squinted, tapping a finger against her temple. Thomas Murphy. Yes, that was it. A quiet one, kept to himself. He didn't stay long, moved on to something else, I heard. He had a small workshop, not far from here actually, a rented space that he eventually just abandoned. Had a lot of ideas, some of them a bit odd, even for costume design. He always talked about perfecting the illusion, making the characters truly real. A name, a lead. After 15 years of nothing, the sheer weight of a concrete piece of information was almost dizzying. Thomas Murphy. The name hung in the air, a whisper from a long-forgotten past, now imbued with a chilling, newfound significance. Sarah felt a surge of cold dread mingle with the persistent hope. This was no random act. This was something meticulously planned, something personal. The costume, the very symbol of Lily's disappearance, was now beginning to tell its own silent, horrifying story, stitch by careful stitch. Sarah wasted no time. The address Mrs. Dorothy had given her for Thomas Murphy's old workshop was etched into her mind, a beacon in the lingering fog of her grief. She immediately called Sheriff Miller, her voice trembling with a mixture of urgency and a fragile, almost manic hope. He listened patiently as she recounted Mrs. Dorothy's recollection of Thomas Murphy, the apprentice with the peculiar way with a needle, and an unsettling obsession with character costumes. The sheriff, initially cautious, recognized the unexpected detail about the non-factory stitching as a genuine lead, aligning perfectly with his own forensics team's preliminary findings. Within the hour, Sarah was in the passenger seat of Sheriff Miller's patrol car, the flashing lights reflecting the tumultuous emotions churning within her. The ride was tense, silent save for the hum of the engine and the distant wail of emergency sirens, constant reminders of the storm's recent devastation. They drove through streets still littered with debris, past houses with tarps for roofs until they reached an older, more rundown part of town. The address led them to a narrow alleyway tucked away behind a row of dilapidated brick buildings. Thomas Murphy's former workshop was a picture of advanced decay. The wooden door hung precariously on one hinge, a splintered testament to years of neglect and the recent hurricane's brutal kiss. The windows were either shattered or boarded up, creating an ominous, almost subterranean gloom within. A thick layer of dust, mixed with storm-driven grime, coated everything, and the air inside was heavy with the musty scent of damp wood, forgotten dreams, and a strange, lingering chemical odor. Sheriff Miller, moving with a practiced caution, pushed the door open further, revealing a space that seemed frozen in time. The room was chaotic, a mad jumble of forgotten tools, tattered fabric scraps, and bizarre, half-finished sketches pinned to the walls. Mannequins, some headless, others draped in faded scraps of velvet and lace, stood like silent sentinels, their hollow eyes adding to the unsettling atmosphere. It was clear that Thomas Murphy had left in a hurry, or perhaps simply abandoned his passion, leaving behind a disquieting tableau of his artistic obsessions. Sarah's eyes scanned the room, her gaze snagging on a pile of worn sketchbooks tucked away in a dusty corner. She pulled them out, her heart pounding. The pages were filled with intricate drawings of costume designs, many of them variations of familiar park characters but distorted, subtly menacing. There were countless renditions of Lucky the Fox, his friendly grin twisted into something unsettling, his eyes sometimes shadowed, almost predatory. It sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't the joyous character Lily had loved. This was something darker, something twisted. As she flipped through one of the sketchbooks, a smaller, leather-bound notebook fell out from between the pages. It was a journal, its cover worn smooth with age and handling. Sheriff Miller, noticing her discovery, knelt beside her. The writing inside was tight, meticulous, almost obsessive. It detailed not just costume ideas, but strange, cryptic musings, half-formed fantasies. "The illusion must be perfect," one entry read. "They must believe. My treasures will be safe, hidden where no one will ever find them, where they will truly be mine." The words sent a cold dread through Sarah, echoing the sheriff's earlier findings about the modified costume. My treasures. It implied possession, a disturbing sense of ownership. And then a series of seemingly random numbers and symbols interspersed with descriptions of unusual flora. It was like a code, perhaps a map. But for what? Sarah and the sheriff exchanged a grim look. This was no ordinary case of a missing child. This was the work of a deeply disturbed individual, and the truth, whatever it was likely far more sinister than anything they had imagined. The storm had not only unearthed a costume and a tape, it had opened a dark, hidden door into a twisted mind. With the journal clutched in her trembling hand, Sarah felt a new, chilling wave of certainty wash over her. The coded entries, the disturbed ramblings, the chilling phrase, "my treasures," it all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple disappearance. Thomas Murphy wasn't just a costume enthusiast, he was a collector, and Lily, it seemed, might have been one of his twisted treasures. Sheriff Miller, his face grim, meticulously photographed each page of the journal. "These numbers and symbols," he mused, pointing to a particularly elaborate sequence, "they don't look like an address or phone number. More like coordinates, or perhaps a cipher. And these plant descriptions, that's unusual for someone in his line of work." He pulled out his phone, making a quick call to dispatch, requesting a specialist to analyze the journal entries. His attention then shifted to the discarded costume sketches, their distorted characters now seeming less whimsical and more like haunting specters. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself drawn to a specific detail in one of the sketches. A small, intricately drawn, floral pattern that adorned the hem of a child's dress depicted next to a menacing Lucky the Fox. It was a highly stylized bloom, almost fantastical, yet it felt familiar. She had seen it somewhere before, a fleeting memory tantalizingly out of reach. Back at her home, the overwhelming urge to solve this puzzle consumed her. The detective in her had been dormant for 15 years, buried under layers of grief, but now it sparked to life. She pulled out old photo albums, relics of a time before the silence. She flipped through pages looking for anything, any small detail that might connect to Thomas Murphy's strange sketches. Then her eyes landed on a page from Lily's kindergarten art show, a colorful, childlike drawing of a fantastical garden. And there it was, sketched crudely but unmistakably, the same stylized floral pattern that adorned the dress in Murphy's drawing. Lily's drawing, dated just weeks before her disappearance, was titled My Dream Garden. A jolt ran through Sarah. Lily had loved drawing. Could this be a clue? Was it possible that Thomas Murphy had seen Lily's drawing? Or perhaps she had mentioned this dream garden to him while in the park, unknowingly giving him a piece of herself. The idea was chilling, turning a child's innocent fantasy into a potential link to her abduction. She immediately called Sheriff Miller again, relaying her discovery. He listened intently. "A dream garden, you say? And a specific flower?" His voice held a renewed interest. That botanical description in Murphy's journal. It might be a clue, not a code, but a geographical indicator. Some rare, unique plant that only grows in a specific location. He promised to have his team cross-reference Murphy's plant descriptions with known botanical gardens and natural preserves in the region. As Sarah hung up, she looked at Lily's drawing, its bright colors now imbued with a somber significance. The innocent art of a child, a fleeting moment of creativity, had become a breadcrumb in a terrifying trail. The pieces, disparate and unrelated for so long, were slowly, agonizingly, beginning to coalesce, revealing not a random act but a deliberate, chilling obsession. The old warehouse, the grotesque costume, the cryptic journal, and now Lily's own childhood drawing. They were all silent witnesses, finally ready to tell their story. Days stretched into an agonizing blur for Sarah as Will painstakingly worked on the salvaged VHS tape. His workshop, once just a cluttered space, now felt like the nerve center of her universe. She called him relentlessly, her questions a barrage of anxious hope. Any progress, any sign. Will, in his quiet, methodical way, would offer sparse updates, emphasizing the extreme damage to the tape, the delicate nature of the restoration process, and the agonizingly slow pace required to avoid destroying the last fragile traces of data. He spoke of microscopic repairs to the magnetic strip, of custom-built mechanisms to coax the damaged tape through the player, of algorithms designed to filter out noise and reconstruct fragmented signals. For Sarah, it was a language of alien complexity, but she trusted him implicitly, her very soul hanging on his every cautious word. Then the call came. It was late, the sky outside Sarah's window a deep, starless black. Will's voice was strained, tired, but there was an unmistakable tremor of excitement in it. "Mrs. Anderson, I've got something. It's not perfect. It's distorted, flickering, but it's there. You need to come down." Sarah didn't even bother to change. She threw on a jacket over her pajamas, grabbed her keys, and sped through the quiet, rain-slicked streets. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and dread. She imagined the worst, a brief, horrifying glimpse of Lily in distress, but even that would be a truth, a painful, necessary truth after 15 years of agonizing uncertainty. She burst into Will's workshop, the air thick with the smell of warm electronics and a strange, almost burnt scent that she realized was the residue of countless hours of intense, delicate work. Will sat hunched over a monitor, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale from exhaustion but alight with a focused intensity. Behind him, an array of improvised equipment whirred softly, a testament to his ingenious dedication. "It's on a loop," Will said, his voice hoarse, gesturing to the screen. "Just a few seconds of footage. The audio is almost non-existent, mostly static, but I've tried to enhance it." Sarah's gaze locked onto the screen. What she saw sent a fresh wave of nausea through her, mingling with a desperate, primal recognition. The image was grainy, jumpy, filled with flickering lines of interference. But it was undeniably Lily. Her daughter, smaller, younger, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, a few years older than when she vanished. She was sitting on a stained plush armchair in a dimly lit, unfamiliar room. The wallpaper behind her was an ugly, floral pattern she had never seen before. Lily looked thin. Her usually vibrant eyes seemed distant, weary. She wasn't smiling. She looked resigned. Then a movement in the background. A blurry figure, tall and indistinct, moved out of frame, but not before Sarah caught a glimpse of something familiar. A distinctive, almost theatrical gesture, and then a sound. Not Lily's voice, but a low, guttural murmur, barely above the static. It was deep, resonating with a disturbing cadence. And though the words were indiscernible, the chilling familiarity of the tone sent an icy spike through Sarah's heart. It was a voice she had heard before, a voice that had once been a comforting presence in their lives. The footage looped again and again, a silent, haunting testament to a stolen childhood. Sarah watched it, tears streaming down her face, a silent scream building in her throat. This wasn't just a glimpse, it was confirmation. Lily had been alive, and someone she knew, someone who had once been close to their family, had been responsible. The fragmented image on the screen was a ghost from the past, now terrifyingly real, pulling her deeper into a nightmare she had hoped was over. The game, it seemed, was far from finished. The revelation from Will's recovered footage was a brutal blow, a twist of the knife in Sarah's already raw wound. The vague, guttural voice from the tape haunted her waking thoughts and invaded her restless sleep. It was unmistakably the voice of Thomas Murphy, the reclusive costume maker. She had heard it countless times in her past, during family gatherings, during brief, uncomfortable encounters when he would visit their home. He had been a peripheral figure in their lives, a friend of her husband's distant cousin, known for his odd eccentricities and his quiet, almost unnerving intensity. The idea that this man, who had once shared meals at their table, could be responsible for Lily's disappearance was a horrifying betrayal. Sarah immediately called Sheriff Miller, her voice tight with a mixture of terror and furious determination. She recounted the chilling details of the tape. Lily, older and diminished, the strange room, and the chilling, indistinct voice. She described Murphy's peculiar mannerisms, his awkward social interactions, and how he had abruptly vanished from their social circle shortly after Lily's disappearance. It was as if he had simply evaporated, leaving no trace. Sheriff Miller listened, his silence on the other end of the line a heavy acknowledgement of the gravity of her words. He confirmed that his team had been quietly investigating Thomas Murphy since Sarah's initial lead from Mrs. Dorothy. They had discovered that Murphy had, in fact, been apprehended and incarcerated several years after Lily's disappearance, not in Florida, but in a federal prison in a neighboring state. The charges were eerily similar: the abduction and unlawful confinement of a young girl, though that victim had eventually been found alive. The news hit Sarah with a fresh wave of sick relief and renewed horror. Lily had indeed been abducted, and the perpetrator was behind bars. But why hadn't this connection been made years ago? Why had Lily not been found? The answer, as the sheriff explained, was crushingly simple and utterly frustrating. Murphy had been a meticulous and cunning individual. He had used a false identity when committing the later crime, had moved frequently, and had never implicated himself in any other abductions. The evidence linking him to Lily had simply not existed until now. A small official plane was arranged, cutting through the early morning clouds. Sarah, accompanied by Sheriff Miller and a lead detective from the state's cold case unit, was on her way to the federal prison. The air inside the small cabin was cold, matching the chill in Sarah's bones. As the landscape below blurred into a patchwork of fields and forests, Sarah rehearsed what she would say, what she would ask. She felt a desperate need to tear into Murphy, to demand answers, to understand the monstrous logic that had driven him. But mostly, she needed to know one thing. Where was Lily? Was she alive? Was she out there somewhere, lost and waiting? The prison itself was a stark, imposing structure, a fortress of concrete and steel. The air inside was heavy, smelling of disinfectant and despair. Thomas Murphy, now a gaunt, hollow-eyed man, was brought into a sterile interview room. He was an unsettling sight, his former odd intensity replaced by a dull, almost vacant stare. He listened to their questions with an unnerving detachment, his responses often evasive, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. He readily admitted to being the one who had taken Lily, to having lured her with the promise of exclusive access to the park's hidden areas, using the altered Lucky the Fox costume. He described her as a special treasure, someone he needed to protect from the world. He confirmed the bunker, the hidden network of tunnels, his twisted fantasy of creating a private Enchanted Kingdom just for her. But when pressed about what had happened to Lily after his capture, his story became muddled. He claimed she had disappeared, that she had run away into the woods after he had a bad spell, a period of disorientation he couldn't fully recall. He insisted he didn't know what became of her, his eyes darting nervously as he spoke. He provided vague, contradictory details about which direction she might have gone, leaving Sarah with a new, agonizing layer of uncertainty. Lily was not with him. She had escaped, but to where? The truth, as revealed by this disturbed man, was a bitter, incomplete victory. Thomas Murphy's vague, rambling testimony in the prison interview room was a cruel, incomplete puzzle. Lily had escaped, he claimed, vanished into the woods. But which woods? And where would a terrified child, disoriented and alone, go? The sheriff's team had nothing new to go on, their investigation hitting another agonizing wall. Yet Sarah refused to yield to despair. The videotape, the journal, the modified costume, they were proof that Murphy had planned everything meticulously. He wouldn't just leave Lily's fate to chance, even in his diminished mental state. There had to be a hidden truth, a secret pathway to her. She returned to Will's workshop, the faint scent of ozone now a familiar comfort. He was hunched over his makeshift workstation, surrounded by glowing monitors and whirring machines, meticulously dissecting every frame of the recovered footage from the original tape. He had already achieved the impossible, pulling Lily's image from the digital abyss, but Sarah urged him to dig deeper. "There has to be something else, Will," she pleaded, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. "A detail, a sound, anything." Will, his intense focus never wavering, nodded silently. He explained that he was now attempting to extract ambient data, the noise that most people filtered out. He was hunting for anomalies in the soundscape, faint echoes, subtle visual cues that might have been overlooked. He ran sophisticated algorithms, custom-designed to magnify the most minute details, to turn static into information. Days bled into nights. Sarah practically lived in Will's workshop, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the desperate hope that flickered in her heart. She watched as Will, with uncanny precision, zoomed in on a tiny, almost imperceptible detail in the background of one of the recovered frames. It was a plant, a cluster of broad, dark green leaves with faint, almost iridescent veins, utterly out of place in the sterile, dimly lit bunker. "This is it," Will murmured, his voice hushed with discovery. "Look at the texture. The light refraction off the leaves. I've been cross-referencing against botanical databases. This isn't common. It's a very specific varietal of a rare fern, native only to a few isolated regions in the state. And it thrives in a very particular microclimate." Sarah's mind raced back to Murphy's journal, to the cryptic botanical descriptions he had meticulously recorded. This fern, it was mentioned there. A chill ran down her spine. Murphy hadn't just been jotting down random thoughts, he had been noting the environment around him, perhaps even the environment of his treasures. The only known habitat for this specific fern in Florida was a small, privately owned botanical garden, nestled deep within a secluded nature preserve, less than an hour's drive from the Enchanted Kingdom. This garden was known for its exotic, carefully curated collections and its strict privacy. Simultaneously, Will's audio analysis yielded another, more subtle clue. Filtering out layers of static, he isolated a faint, distorted snippet of sound. It was the tail end of a radio broadcast, barely audible, but one phrase became startlingly clear. "ICKY, Summer Program for Exceptional Children." The broadcast seemed to reference a local charity, one that had operated out of a small, discreet facility near the Botanical Garden back in the early 90s, offering summer camps and programs for children with special needs. This facility, Sarah remembered from old local news segments, had eventually closed down, ostensibly due to funding issues. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying yet illuminating precision. Murphy's obsession with collecting children, his meticulous planning, the specific botanical details, and now, the faint radio broadcast. It was a terrifying hypothesis, but it was the only one that made sense. What if Murphy, in his deranged state, hadn't simply left Lily to wander into the woods? What if he had somehow placed her, believing he was giving her a safe, hidden sanctuary, perhaps even leveraging his past knowledge of this charity? Sarah looked at Will, her eyes burning with a renewed, desperate resolve. They had a new lead, a precise direction. They had to go to that botanical garden, to that long-forgotten charity facility. The hunt for Lily was no longer a shot in the dark. It was a focused, harrowing race against time and a deeply disturbed mind. The botanical garden was a place of eerie, almost silent beauty. Even after the hurricane which had pruned and reshaped many of its outer fringes, the core remained an oasis of carefully cultivated nature. Exotic blooms, vibrant against the backdrop of dark, damp earth, released an intoxicating perfume into the humid air. Ancient trees, draped with Spanish moss, cast long, shifting shadows, creating a sense of timelessness, of secrets held deep within the earth. For Sarah, however, the beauty was overshadowed by a creeping dread. This was a place of beauty, yes, but it was also a potential hiding place, a living map to a twisted mind. Sheriff Miller, accompanied by Sarah and a small team of deputies, moved through the winding paths. They had arrived with a search warrant, their presence a stark contrast to the garden's tranquil atmosphere. Sarah clutched the botanical diagram from Murphy's journal, cross-referencing it with the rare ferns Will had identified. The deputies spread out, meticulously searching the dense foliage, their radios crackling with low murmurs. The search was slow, painstaking. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every sudden bird call sent a jolt of anticipation and fear through Sarah. She imagined Lily, a terrified child, navigating this labyrinth of trees and plants alone. The sheer scale of the preserve was overwhelming, a vast, green wilderness where a small person could vanish without a trace. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Just as hope began to wane, a deputy called out, his voice sharp with discovery. "Sheriff, over here. Looks like an old path almost completely overgrown." They converged on the spot. Tucked away behind a dense thicket of bamboo and wild azaleas was a barely discernible trail. It wasn't on any of the park's official maps, a forgotten access route, perhaps, or a path used by groundskeepers in a bygone era. The air here was cooler, damper, and the silence seemed to press in, broken only by the chirping of crickets. The path led them deeper into the preserve, away from the manicured gardens towards an area that felt wilder, untouched. The foliage grew thicker, the trees taller, their branches intertwining overhead to create a perpetual twilight. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and damp earth. After what felt like an eternity, the trail opened into a small, unexpected clearing. And there it was. Not a grand structure, but a weathered, single-story building, its wooden siding warped and peeling, its windows dark and empty. It was the former site of the charity facility, the one referenced in the old radio broadcast Will had found. The very air around it felt heavy with abandonment, a silent testament to its long disuse. A sign, half-rotted and barely legible, hung above the entrance. The Sanctuary of Serenity. Summer program for exceptional children. The name, once meant to convey peace, now sounded chillingly ironic. The building looked like it had been swallowed by the surrounding nature, vines snaking around its decaying porch, moss clinging to its roof. The entrance was boarded up, but the hurricane had torn away some of the planks, revealing a dark, yawning opening. Sheriff Miller, with a flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, entered first, his hand on his holstered weapon. Sarah followed, her heart a frantic drum. Inside, the building was a time capsule of neglect. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light filtering through cracks in the boarded windows. Old, rusty cots were pushed against the walls of what looked like a dormitory. Toys, broken and faded, lay scattered on the floor. A headless doll, a deflated ball, a stack of worn picture books. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay, a grim reminder of the years that had passed. Then, in a far corner, partially obscured by a fallen shelf, Sarah saw it. A small, meticulously constructed cubby, clearly built for a child. Inside, arranged neatly, were a few items. A faded, yellow sundress, almost identical to the one Lily had worn the day she disappeared, a collection of worn, brightly colored crayons, and a dog-eared book. A lump formed in Sarah's throat. This was it. This was where Lily had been. This was where Thomas Murphy's twisted sanctuary had been. The silent tableau of a forgotten childhood, preserved in dust and decay, was almost too much to bear. It was a place of profound sadness, but also of a terrible, undeniable truth. Lily had been here. She had survived. And now, armed with this knowledge, Sarah felt a desperate surge of conviction. Lily had to be found. The discovery of the Sanctuary of Serenity was a chilling vindication, a confirmation of Lily's terrifying ordeal. But it was also a place steeped in decay, a stark testament to years of abandonment. The absence of Lily herself, the fact that Murphy claimed she had escaped, left a gaping hole in Sarah's heart. They had found the cage, but the bird had flown. The search for Lily now moved from a haunting memory to a desperate, urgent present. Sheriff Miller immediately organized a meticulous search of the surrounding nature preserve, expanding the perimeter far beyond the garden. Drones whirred overhead. Thermal cameras scanned the dense foliage, and K-9 units, trained for human scent, moved through the underbrush. Sarah walked alongside them, her eyes scanning every shadow, every rustle. She held on to Murphy's journal, now a lifeline, scrutinizing its cryptic entries about the plants, the special places in the woods. She felt a profound connection to Lily in that wilderness, a sense that if anyone could survive out here, it was her resilient, imaginative little girl. Days turned into a grueling week. The physical toll was immense, but the emotional strain was even greater. Each false alarm, each faint trace that led nowhere, chipped away at her fragile hope. The terrain was challenging, riddled with hidden hollows, dense thickets, and winding streams, all made more treacherous by the hurricane's recent fury. The local community, galvanized by the renewed search and the chilling story emerging, rallied to help, their faces etched with a shared determination. Then, on the 6th day of the expanded search, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the forest floor, a faint glimmer caught Sarah's eye. Tucked away beneath a gnarled cypress root, half buried in damp leaves, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was painted with bright, faded colors, unmistakably Lily's artistic style from her kindergarten days. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was no random object. It was a beacon, a sign that Lily had passed this way, perhaps left it as a trail marker. Sarah's cry drew the attention of Sheriff Miller and a few nearby volunteers. Following the direction the bird faced, they pushed deeper into the dense woods. The path became less defined, but the vegetation showed subtle signs of passage. A broken twig here, a flattened patch of moss there. The air grew cooler, and a distinct, almost smoky scent mingled with the earthy dampness began to reach them. Finally, through a veil of hanging Spanish moss, a small makeshift structure came into view. It was a crude lean-to, fashioned from branches and tarps, nestled ingeniously into a natural hollow. Smoke curled lazily from a small stone fire pit nearby. A hush fell over the search party. This was it. Sheriff Miller cautiously approached the dwelling, his flashlight beam cutting through the gathering gloom. As they drew closer, a figure emerged from the shadows of the lean-to. She was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, slender and wiry, with tangled, sun-streaked blonde hair and eyes that were wide and wary, like a wild deer. Her clothes were patched and worn, her skin tanned and weathered, but undeniably healthy. For a moment Sarah froze, unable to breathe, her eyes locked onto the young woman's face, searching for a trace of the little girl she had lost. And then she saw it. The faint freckle on her nose, the slight tilt of her chin, the familiar shape of her lips. It was Lily. Older, hardened by an unimaginable existence, but unmistakably her Lily. A choked sob escaped Sarah's throat. "Lily," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible. The young woman flinched, her eyes widening further, clearly unaccustomed to human voices, to such direct address. She didn't recognize the name, or perhaps she had buried it deep. She looked at Sarah with a mixture of fear and profound curiosity, her gaze flickering to the worried, hopeful faces of the search party behind her. Sheriff Miller, sensing the delicate balance of the moment, stepped forward, speaking in a low, gentle tone, explaining who they were, how they had found her. He showed her an old, faded photograph of Lily as a child, standing beside her parents at Enchanted Kingdom. As Lily's gaze fell upon the photograph, something shifted in her eyes. A flicker of confusion, then a ripple of recognition, deep and raw. Her hand, calloused and strong, reached out, trembling, to touch the image of her younger self, her parents' smiling faces. Then her eyes lifted to Sarah's, and in that moment, something clicked. A memory, long suppressed, broke through the protective barriers of her mind. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her weathered cheek, not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming, long-forgotten connection. Sarah rushed forward, falling to her knees, extending her arms. "Lily, my darling, it's Mom." And in that remote, secluded clearing, under the fading light of the setting sun, after 15 years of desperate searching and silent grief, a daughter, lost to the wilderness, finally returned to her mother's embrace. It was not the reunion Sarah had ever imagined. No Disney fireworks, no perfect, untouched child. It was a reunion born of pain and struggle, a testament to resilience, a fragile miracle etched into the wild heart of the forest. The journey to healing would be long, fraught with challenges, but Lily was alive. And for Sarah, that was everything. The story, finally, had a hopeful ending.